Hello everyone! In this video I wanted to show you one way of creating fire magic sounds from scratch by mixing recorded source and synthesis. I like making small projects for myself as practice, and for me I like having some sort of goal or framework in mind when I do it. For this practice the goal is to redesign the fire magic spells from Skyrim and try to make them fit inside the world. I can only use source from my own library and synthesis, so no Soundly, Boom or any other third-party sound library. Me and Simon, who are my colleagues but mainly just really good friends, had a field recording day a while back where we recorded a bunch of fireworks and other miscellaneous sounds. It was for another project, but I figured they would also be perfect for this little practice. Also, remember to use caution when recording fireworks or fire in general. I picked the sounds that I felt were important to this project and started making assets. The assets are a collection of sounds that I think will be needed when I do the final redesigns. And I also made some synth patches inside Faceplant that had some degree of control. For example, this low-end rumble patch that I will use as a low-end layer in most of the sounds. And this fire whoosh patch that allows me to control the speed of the whoosh. I also made a simple noise boom that I will layer underneath the sounds for extra impact and also for filling out the frequency range, making my sounds fuller and more complete. The reason why I chose Skyrim is because it's fairly simple getting your sounds into the game, and also because I've played the game a lot. So I have an idea of the soundscape. I think the original sounds are really cool and have quite a lot of character. They're quite rustic and they just feel like Skyrim. They don't really have the flashy, sharp, high-definition character of, say, anime-style magic or the usual MMORPG style. Which are also really cool, don't get me wrong, but since the goal is to make my sounds fit into the game, this is not what I'll try to replicate. I imported the original sounds into Reaper as a reference when creating my own. I'll be using tools such as span and a loudness meter to compare them with my own sounds and tweak from there. I'm using sub-projects to keep it organized inside the main project. For this video, I'll show you how I made some of the bigger sounds. Let's start with the sound of the player casting a firebolt. The process is really quite messy and I structured it up just for this video. It's like when someone is coming to visit and you rapidly start cleaning your home before they arrive. Most of the time, I just trust my gut when adding different components and post-processing. For many of the assets, I started by designing the low end of the spectrum, so I have something to build from. I start with the noise boom patch and the low-end rumble patch for this, with a kilohertz faturator on top for extra oomph in the transient. I then added two fire poof sounds and hard panned them left and right, respectively. Together with one of the firework recordings, it sounded like this. On the parent track, I also used distortion and quite the aggressive transient shaper, both of which I automated the wet knob. I then just duplicated this entire group, added a high-pass EQ and the stock exciter from Reaper, which I really love by the way. This high-end sizzle gave some life to the sound. I also noticed a really cool sound in the beginning. It kinda sounded like a really sharp ignition sound. I wanted to emphasize this, so I made this. And together it sounded like this. The final sound I added was a short fire whoosh from the fire whoosh patch. I did this to fill out and make the sound a little bit longer. It's quite subtle. I was happy with the result and I added a C4 multiband compressor just as is to compress and smooth out the sound. Also there's a soothe too, which I automated to gradually remove the sub-frequencies as the sound went on. It just sounds cleaner. I then added a K-clip to get the volume up and clip the sound rather than limit. I then compared it to the original and did some correction EQ and another clipper so that it doesn't clip. I want to go for my own style, but I still want the balance to be similar to the original in terms of frequency distribution. Next up we got this flamethrower-like spell, and it has 3 parts. An initial cast, that goes into a loop, that then goes into a release. I'll quickly show you its building blocks that I totally didn't make up for this showcase. Here we have the core sound of the looping part, and once again I used my patches and assets that I created before to build this. I put a flanger effect on one of the tracks, and don't ask me why, but it makes the sound feel really hot, as in temperature. I also added some distorted white noise and EQ'd it to fill out some space from around 800 Hz and upward, because that part sounded really empty. It made the sound a little bit more full. I added the noise boom patch at the transients and the sharp ignition sound from the Firebolt Spell earlier. Lastly, a fireproof and fire whooshes were also added at the transients. I wanted the sound to have more prominent low end, so I added a multiband saturator targeting that part. I also added a snap heap module that activates a multipass preset through a MIDI trigger. This was because I felt the last transient needed some kind of ducking sound to signify the end of the loop. It was really quite experimental, and I didn't have a specific multipass preset in mind. So I tried a few, and this one did the trick, I think. When I was done, I did some final editing when comparing it to the original sound. This part was really messy, but as long as the final product works, I think that's okay. I made the middle of the sound into a perfect loop, and noticed the original sound has these markers to signify the start and end of the loop. My guess was that the game code uses these markers to know what part of the sound is a loop, and I've never encountered it before, but it turns out you can embed markers like this into a WAV file. Luckily, this is achievable in Reaper when rendering, given you've set up regions. For the Firestorm, which is like a high-level AoE explosion, I needed to beef it up quite a lot compared to earlier. Again, I used my patches to build a low and a sub layer. These are the sounds included in the low end. I shaped the sound with these effects on the parent of the group, and the results sound quite cool, I think. I then added a fireproof with a saturator on it. It's sidechain compressed through a signal from the low end group. I then wanted to add a rumbling tail, and achieved this with one of the firework recordings. On this track I added a moving filter and panning effects to give it some motion. Lastly, I cut the low end a bit with an EQ so that it doesn't steal too much spotlight from the already crammed initial hit. I added a high-end layer to the sound by taking the Firebolt Spell and just removing the bottom with an EQ. And then I hard panned it to the sides together with some additional fire foley. I dig the sound, but it felt like the transient had to be a little bit more punchy, so I added 2 kicks and some hard-panned noise. This created a sort of double transient, and I thought it sounded cool alongside the rest of the sound. At the end of the chain, I added a C4 to compress it like a cherry on top, unifying the sound a little bit. I also added a clipper and made the stereo image a bit less wide. I applied the same process to this sound as I did with the others and compared to the original. I balanced it with an EQ and lowered the gain a little bit. Okay, so now that I show you the process of creating some of these sounds, let's compare them in-game to see if I accomplish what I set out to do. And now let's see it in action.
I swear you won't leave here alive!
What was that? Thought I heard something. It's nothing. You won't live to see tomorrow.
You're a disgrace to your own kind. Death awaits you.
All in all, this was a really fun project, and I think it turned out quite fine. Thanks for watching.